There is something curiously haunting about a melody that smiles through tears. Dmitri Shostakovich's Waltz No. 2 is one of those rare pieces, instantly recognizable, almost deceptively light, yet hiding entire worlds of irony, longing, and quiet defiance beneath its graceful surface. It waltzes, yes, but with eyes half closed, as if dreaming of a world it cannot touch. Today, audiences around the world know it as the Russian waltz, the eyes wide shut waltz, the melody of elegance and melancholy that seems to float from another time. But behind its charm lies one of the most fascinating musical stories of the 20th century. A story of art under tyranny, of laughter at the edge of fear, and of a composer who turned the dance floor into a stage for truth. Dmitri Dmitrievich Shostakovich was born in St. Petersburg in 1906, a city poised between elegance and upheaval, soon to be swept into revolution. By the time he reached his 20s, the Russian Empire had dissolved into the Soviet Union, and music was no longer merely art, it was ideology. Shostakovich's early brilliance had already set him apart. His first symphony, written as a student, stunned audiences. A modern, bold, sardonic voice from a young man barely out of his teens. The piece we now know as Waltz No. 2 comes from Shostakovich's Suite for Variety Orchestra, often dated to the late 1950s. Its exact origins are still debated, since much of the music was assembled or adapted from earlier film and ballet scores. But the waltz itself, bright, lyrical, unforgettable, feels like a summation of Shostakovich's paradoxical spirit. The piece opens with a single, slow-stepping drum, a soft, dignified beat, like the sound of measured footsteps across a grand ballroom floor. The saxophone enters next, its tone smooth and nostalgic, carrying a melody that seems to smile wistfully over its shoulder. Soon, the violins pick up the dance, joined by clarinet, brass, and a gently circling rhythm in the strings. Everything is lush, romantic, familiar, yet somehow uneasy. Beneath the glitter, something trembles. Shostakovich's genius was not only melodic, but psychological. His waltz moves in elegant circles, but the harmony shifts restlessly beneath it, slipping into unexpected chords. The melody rises and falls like a sigh, never quite resolving. It is music that seems to remember joy rather than live in it. In the 19th century, Johann Strauss had given Vienna its waltzes, pure expressions of grace and celebration. Shostakovich gives the waltz a Soviet face, smiling, polished, but with a shadow behind the eyes. It is the sound of an empire pretending to dance. Waltz No. 2 fits this pattern perfectly. On the surface, it is festive, almost cinematic. Yet listen closely. The melody never truly relaxes. Its sweetness feels rehearsed, its rhythm slightly mechanical, like dancers who must keep smiling under surveillance. The clarinet's laughter has a nervous edge. The brass sounds both proud and weary. It is music as a mask, a waltz that hides its tears in public. In the 1950s and 60s, Soviet audiences loved this kind of music. It was familiar, tuneful, reassuring. It played in ballrooms, on the radio, in films celebrating the joys of the socialist way of life. For them, the Waltz No. 2 might have felt like pure nostalgia, a dream of order and beauty in uncertain times. But Shostakovich's international listeners sensed something else. The irony, the bittersweet smile, the quiet protest disguised as dance. Curiously, the piece's modern fame began not in the Soviet Union, but decades later in the West. After Shostakovich's death in 1975, much of his lighter music remained little known outside Russia. Then, in the 1980s, the Waltz No. 2 was rediscovered, but for years it was mistakenly labeled as part of his Suite for Jazz Orchestra No. 2, 1938. Only later did scholars determine that it actually belonged to a later suite, the Suite for Variety Orchestra. The confusion stuck, and even today, many recordings and programs still call it Jazz Suite No. 2. In 1999, Stanley Kubrick's film Eyes Wide Shut used it as its main theme, a choice both brilliant and fitting. Kubrick understood what Shostakovich was doing, showing the beauty of appearances and the danger beneath them. In Eyes Wide Shut, the waltz becomes the sound of masked desire and moral ambiguity, exactly the territory Shostakovich himself had lived in. The irony of its Soviet origins only deepened its meaning. Music written under surveillance became the soundtrack of secrecy and illusion. Since then, the waltz has appeared everywhere, in ballets, television, and concerts worldwide. It has become shorthand for elegance tinged with unease, a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. To understand Shostakovich's art is to understand contradiction. He was both the state's composer and its critic, both celebrated and censored. He wrote film scores for Soviet propaganda and quartets that whispered private grief. Even in his symphonies, the dance returns again and again, grotesque, tragic, or absurd. The waltz was one of his favorite masks, an image of order that barely conceals chaos. The music invites the listener to dance, but beneath each step is the memory of silence, the silence of those who could not speak. There is no bitterness in it, only knowing. The music forgives nothing, but it understands everything. Today, Waltz No. 2 stands as one of Shostakovich's most beloved works because it wears no heavy armor. It slips into the heart quietly, like a melody you think you've always known. It also bridges two worlds, the official and the personal, the collective and the intimate. In 3 minutes of dance, it captures the spirit of an entire century, a century that learned to smile through tragedy, to waltz in ruins, to find grace even in absurdity. When orchestras perform it today, from Moscow to Montreal, from Vienna to Tokyo, they often do so as an encore, a final bow after a storm of symphonic intensity. And every time the saxophone begins that wistful opening phrase, the audience smiles, some knowingly, some innocently. In the end, the Waltz No. 2 is not about countries or politics or even about Shostakovich himself. It is about the human condition, the eternal dance between beauty and despair. It is music that remembers everything: the laughter, the lies, the courage, the weariness, and yet still dares to dance. And so the waltz turns again. The drum beat steps forward. The saxophone sighs. The violins lift their voices in bittersweet splendor. The music circles once more. Elegant, ironic, eternal. A dance beneath the mask. A smile that knows. A memory that refuses to fade.